My name is Steve Corverhouse. I've been with Software AG now for about 12 years, just over. And I specialise in the GRC product, which we refer to as the ARIS Risk and Compliance Manager. My role is basically to help implement the system in different customer environments and, configure the system to the requirements of the customer. So for that, I'm not a technical consultant, but for that, obviously, I would be using technical consultants to do the necessary configuration if any changes were required. Okay, so that's my role. So the purpose of today's session is to give you a quick overview of the risk assessment capabilities of ARIS. Okay, so let me just move on to the agenda. I'm going to take you through from beginning right through to the end, if you like. So I'm going to give you, first of all, a quick overview of governance, risk and compliance, and indeed of our ARIS Risk and Compliance Manager, our GRC tool. And then I'm going to move on to how do we set up the data in ARIS Connect in order to drive these workflows. Okay, I'm not going to major too much on that because obviously the modeling is not the most exciting part of it. But you need to understand how it's implemented. And then we'll move on to the GRC tool itself, ARIS ARCM, and we'll look at some of the parameters that we need to set that govern the workflow. So for example, we have parameters around what we call impact types and whether or not certain roles within the system are informed when risk assessments or when risks pose a certain level of risk. So certain parameters that we need to set, and I'll cover that before we then look on point 4, which is performing the risk assessments themselves in the tool. So we'll cover that end to end, and then we'll have a brief look at some of the results of risk assessments. So how do you view risk assessments in the tool, and can you see the risk assessment results in Connect as well? So in the risk object in Connect, you can also view the results there as well. So we'll cover it from beginning to end, if you like. So a general overview of the GRC lifecycle I'll start with. So this is a pretty typical slide. So we're obviously focusing on risk assessments, but obviously we need to see it in a wider picture. So any company will have a set of objectives and business goals, and they'll need to identify what risks they have to achievement of those goals and objectives. Okay, once you've identified the risks, you then perform risk assessments. And that really means just assessing the risk in terms of its impact, should it occur, what's the damage that it could do, if you like, and the probability or the frequency of that occurrence. So how many times do you think it's going to occur in a given period of time? And based on that impact and probability, you will then plot it or plot that risk on what we call a heat map, which is represented here. Once you know your risks and the level of risk that they pose to the business, you can then decide what you're going to do about it. So do you wish to tolerate it? We're not worried about it. You could avoid it, completely avoid the business activity that brings that risk on, or you could take some sort of preemptive action. So you could introduce some controls over the risk to help mitigate its impact, or transfer the risk by insurance, for example. So that's what we talk about when we refer to respond to the risk. And then, of course, you may wish to design certain controls and implement those controls to mitigate the risk. And those controls then need to be tested. So how effective are the controls in mitigating that risk? And you can define certain remedial action if you need to. So if you found a weakness there, or you need to add another control, you can raise action plans. And again, you can process those through our GRC tool, allocate them to individuals to action and through to resolution. And of course, in the cycle as well, you may well have incidents. Now, an incident is just an occurrence of a risk. So the risk actually might occur, and you can then raise a record in the tool and link that risk to it. So this incident is caused by that risk occurring. And then as subsequent losses may arise, you can link those losses to that case as well. So you know for a risk, certain incidents have occurred, resulting in certain losses. And generally, you can monitor performance. So how well is everything, how well are the controls mitigating the risk? Are there any action plans still outstanding that haven't been rectified, etc. And then from this monitoring, you can then look at, well, do we need to look at our objectives and our business goals? Do we need to make any changes to that? And then you go around the life cycle again. So that's where really risk assessments fits into it, just here. And that's just a brief overview of the life cycle itself. So now looking at ARIS Risk and Compliance Manager. So ARIS is a component system or modular system, if you like. So if you want to think of it like this, the enterprise modeling is where in ARIS Connect or in ARIS Architect, you would be creating your business process models and your organizational structures, details of your IT system infrastructure, etc. This is the modeling and enterprise modeling component, usually, as I say, now in ARIS Connect. And of course, you can publish those models and make them available to general users for viewing on the ARIS portal, via Connect, the web-based tool. And of course, integrated into that as well, you have reporting and dashboarding capabilities where you can monitor the results of different activities. Now, this is not really relevant for this presentation, so just ignore this particular aspect. But this is the ARIS Risk and Compliance Manager here. So effectively what we do is we create the risks in the modeling aspect of ARIS, and we link those risks to certain other artifacts within the database, those being process elements, process steps, organizational structures, application systems that might be affected by the risk, etc. Okay, so we make a variety of different relationships using different model types in enterprise modeling, and all that is stored in a repository. And as part of the risk, there's a number of attributes, and some of those attributes will actually drive the workflows in our risk management tool. So, for example, when do you want to start performing risk assessments on a risk? How often do you want those risk assessments to be generated? Weekly, monthly, annually? There's an attribute basically to be set to say how often you want it done. And of course, once it's created in the system, how long has the user got in order to perform that task? Okay, another attribute that we maintain for the risk. And we also have to capture details of who is going to perform that activity. So who's going to perform the risk assessment, who's going to review the results of that assessment. We have sort of predefined roles in these workflow tools that we need to assign business users to, and I'll come on to that in a moment. So that's how it works. So you model the relationships you add the risk to ARIS, you model the relationships to other components in ARIS, and then that information then becomes available to the workflow tool. And the workflow tool then will basically automatically identify from the attributes of the risk when you want the risk assessments to be generated, and then from the modeling, who do I need to send this task to? Which risk assessor has got the responsibility for performing it? And it will generate that task and put them in their queue. Okay, so that's how it works. It's because a modular system. Quite often companies will start with the business process management and then add on the risk and compliance element later on and do the modeling that supports it in the enterprise modeling component. Okay, so that's an overview of the tool. Now let's quickly look at a representation of ARCM itself. So in the red box here, this is ARCM, and these are the different workflows that are available in the tool. Okay, and around the outside, we've got the modeling component, the publishing, dashboarding, all which is ARIS Connect or ARIS Architect. But this is the component I wish to sort of talk about just for the next 2 or 3 minutes. So here we have the different modules. There's about 12, I think now. Operational risk management is the one we're going to center on today. So that is really risk assessments. Okay, but it also associated with the operational risk management is things like incident management. So we can perform risk assessments, but if a risk occurs, we can record an incident and we can record losses that subsequently arise from the incidents, certain workflows that we've got available in the system. We've also got things like control testing. So as I said earlier, you've got risks that may have a number of different controls, and are those controls operated effectively? And we can run control tests to make sure that they are. Other relevant workflows will be issue management. So again, a standard out of the box workflow that's available. And this is basically, if you identify a problem or an issue within the control testing or the risk assessments, and you want to raise an action plan, it's the issue management workflow that would do that for you. So you'd record the problem, record what action plan you want to take, and allocate it to a user to actually perform that remedial action. And you can trace that through the system and to completion. Okay, and as you can see, there are other elements as well, like you can run your audit program on here, record your different audits, allocate it to staff, generate the audit tasks, etc. So all of these different workflows are available, but typically business users will start with one or two process flows. So for example, they may well decide to implement risk assessments and issue management at the same time because they're kind of complementary, or they may include or rather start with control testing, etc. So again, it's usually a phased approach to implementation of these different modules. But let's continue with risk assessments. So as I mentioned, the tool actually is basically typically a two-stage process. So most of these workflows will operate with somebody doing an activity and there's someone reviewing that activity. So performing a risk assessment, reviewing a risk assessment, performing a control test, reviewing a control test. Okay, and these are standard roles that are available within the tool. And what we need to do is basically allocate business users to those roles so that when that user logs into the system knows that Fred is a risk assessor or Joe is a risk reviewer, etc. Okay, so allocation of business users to predefined workflow roles is one of the tasks in the modeling. So as I say, the capabilities, as I say, you can visualize your risk statuses, you can identify the risks that you have within your business processes, and you can map those risks onto the processes. And again, different model types we can use for that purpose. You can also categorize your risk and say, well, this is a risk, it's an IT category type risk. And then you can also develop strategies to reduce the enterprise risk. Getting a bit of feedback here. I don't know if anybody's getting that. Okay, let's try to continue. All right, so when you perform these risk assessments, ultimately they will generate or place that risk on a heat map, which is basically your probability and your impact and probability being your axis, and then it plots it on a map. And it shows obviously the reds being the high probability, high risk, and the greens being low probability, low risk. Okay, so you can see here that we've got a collection of risks that would probably need some sort of attention and control tests. All right, so let me just quickly go through some of the basics of modeling. So next 5-10 minutes, no more, Dan, just looking at the modeling here. And then I will show you briefly on the system. So within the ARIS repository, you've got a number of different models available to you. Now, principally for risk assessments, we'll use this model here, this KPI allocation diagram. This red object is the risk. And then we can say, first of all, what role or who is going to perform the assessments and who is going to review it. So these are roles that in another diagram, we've already associated the business users that are going to fulfill those roles. So who's going to risk assess it? Who's going to review that completed assessment? Okay, and those individuals allocated to these roles. We can also say that this risk affects an organizational unit, or it affects an application system. It has perhaps a KPI also, or an initiative object associated with it. So there's a lot of detail that we can capture within these models. But principally for our purposes, risk assessments, you need to allocate the people that are going to perform the tasks and the reviewing, okay, which is this part here. If this risk has got controls, then there's another diagram called the business controls diagram, where we can say, here's the risk. It's got a control in this case, or it might have multiple. And these controls have got certain tests. Okay, so again, another model used to make certain relationships. This model is if you wanted to incorporate this risk into a particular risk category. So this risk might be part of IT or a finance risk. We can categorize it under the finance category or the risk IT category, or whatever that category might be. So another type of diagram we use for that. And of course, probably most importantly, people want to capture the risk against the process. So you can add risks into EPC diagrams or BPMNs, but typically what we would do is have them in what we call function allocation diagrams that sit behind the EPC or the BC or the BPMN diagrams. Okay, so lots of different relationships being made that then will give you added value when you're looking to analyze the effect of risks on certain things, like if a risk occurs, how would it affect certain systems or affect certain processes? Okay, so this is basically what we call the authorization diagram. It's an organizational chart really, but all we're doing here is taking an individual, a user, and linking them to some sort of predefined role. So in this case, it's a risk owner group, which is a risk assessment group. And you might have different assessment groups for different parts of the business. You might have one for sales, a different group do the review of risks that are IT related, a different group do IT risk, do finance type risk assessments, etc. And you would just allocate the individuals to those particular relevant groups. And if you look at here, for example, this one's highlighted, these are the attributes. So it's saying this role is a risk owner role. So the system will know from this object and this attribute that this individual that's attached to it is going to perform the role of a risk assessor. Okay, so that's how we allocate the roles. And you might have one or more person in each group. So it's relevant, it's quite okay to have just one person in a particular test in a risk assessment group, but you might have 2 or 3 different people doing the same role. In which case, when the task generated, all of them will receive that task in their work queue, but whoever opens it and actions it first, it will lock it to that individual. Okay, so one or more person per role, no problem. You could also have users assigned to more than one role. So it might be a risk assessor for sales, and they might be a tester, another type of role in the system for another part of the business or whatever. Okay, so an individual can belong to multiple groups, and you can have multiple individuals in a group. Okay, just a bit of background. So this is the principal model, as I said, and as I went through before, we have these different, so this is how you allocate the roles to the risk assessment. It can affect it can affect an application system and an org unit, etc. But what I wanted to show you on this slide was this piece here. So again, the risk is highlighted. So these are the attributes of the risk. And you can see these are the GRC management attributes. So in other words, these are the elements or the attributes that drive the workflow. So first of all, we said, yes, we want to perform risk assessments on this risk. So again, it's a checkbox, you need to set it. We want this to be transferred and made available in the workflow tool. We want risk assessments to start from this date, and we want them done quarterly. Okay, so these are the main attributes that drive the workflow. And then once that's generated in the system, the allocated user will have 90 days in which to perform that task before it automatically self-closes. And just lastly, this particular attribute just means that if you want to be able to perform risk assessments outside of the stated frequency, then if you're a risk manager and this attribute is checked, you can create ad hoc assessments as well. Okay, so that's all I wanted to say on that. So just very briefly, let's just jump on to the system. So am I showing the right one now? Yes, you can see. I'll just extend my display as well. So you can see that I'm just about to log in as a user. Now this user has got multiple different roles, but for the purpose of this, he's a risk assessor. So I've just logged into the system, into ARIS Connect, and I'm just going to briefly show you that modeling in the tool. I'm not going to go over it and say the same things again, but I just wanted to show you. So I'm going to navigate to it by using my favorites. And I've already got one model that's open. So here you can see, if I go to the diagram view, we've got a KPI allocation diagram. So here's the risk. These are the allocated, turn that off a moment. These are the allocated owner or assessor and the reviewer groups that will perform this assessment and review of that risk assessment. And it affects an organization unit, and in this case, an application system. Now, if I just switch on the fact sheet again, I can see that there's a fact sheet available for a risk. And if I expand it, it gives me information like the general description, what objects are related to it, so a process, an application system, different controls, an organizational unit down here. But I can also see the GRC management ones as well. So we can see, for example, that this is the assigned risk assessor group. This is the assigned reviewer groups. And over here, we've got these attributes that then drive it. So as I said before, when do we want to start risk assessments from? What frequency do we want them to be performed? Are we allowing these ad hoc assessments outside of this period? Yes, we are in this case. And once the assessment's generated, we've got 90 days in which to perform it. Okay, so it's a fact sheet that gives you all the necessary information about how we manage the workflows in GRC. Incidentally, I'll show you this now as well. This risk is already in a test system and it has been used before. So it's got, once you've performed the risk assessment, those risk assessments are also available in ARIS Connect. So from the fact sheet now, I've got a tab called Risk Assessments, and I can see that it's got a number of different assessments have been performed over different periods of time. Okay, and over here, I can actually click on that to go and look at the risk assessment information. Okay, so which I'll show you in a moment anyway. But also we've got incidents. So if there have been any incidents recorded in the ARCM workflow, incident workflow, then those incidents would also be available within ARIS Connect rather than going into the ARCM tool itself. Okay, just to show you where some information is about. Now having done that, I think what I need to do now is just go back to the presentation just for a second. Bear with me. And what I want to do now is just talk to you about, I want to talk to you about the next step. So what we've done so far then is we've basically modeled the data and set up our risks in ARIS. We've allocated business users to predefined roles for the process workflow, so for risk assessors, for risk reviewers, for risk managers as well. And what I need to do now is just talk to you about what we need to do to prepare the ARCM system. So ARCM has an administration module within it. Okay. Now, before I go into that, just a quick summary of some of the terminology. So obviously risk assessments, you know what risk assessments are. We're just looking at identifying risks related to a process or a business project or something. And we are then assessing them in terms of, well, what damage could this do? What's its impact? Should it occur? And what's the probability or the likelihood that it will occur? Okay, and we're plotting that on a heat map. Or we're coming up with a financial impact value. So what's the expected loss? I don't know, it could cost us 500,000 if this risk occurred, and it's going to occur, or we've estimated it could occur 2 times every year. So then that could cost us £1 million a year. So expected loss 1 million. So either we're assessing it and plotting it on a heat map, in terms of high, medium, and low probability, high, medium, and low impact, or we're doing some sort of financial assessment to say it's going to cost us, or expected loss is going to be a certain figure. Okay, so impact and probability, impact and likelihood, yes, is what I mentioned. And then there's two types of assessments. So an inherent risk assessment is one in which you're doing the assessment of the risk, imagining that there's no controls. So it's the worst case scenario. So if we didn't have any controls and this risk occurred, what's the worst case scenario? And we refer to that as the inherent risk. We also have, you can think of it as well as residual risk. So what happens now, we think of that we have these controls in place over this risk, and those controls obviously are aimed at reducing either the impact or the probability or both of that risk. So given the fact that we've got these controls, what do we think the impact and probability of that risk will be now? So we refer to that as the residual risk. And as you can imagine, if you've got a high risk, high probability as an inherent risk assessment, and then you've got three controls that are effective, and you know they're effective, then the likelihood is that that will then reduce it to perhaps a low impact and an average probability or something to that effect. Okay, so it depends what the control is and how that control operates. So that's inherent and residual. And then the other thing I wanted to talk about was qualitative and quantitative. So I've already kind of touched on it. So qualitative is where you just assess the risk based on impact and probability, but where you have a certain number of categories for impact and a certain number of categories for probability. And the easiest one to think of is just high, medium, and low in each. So that would be like a 3x3 grid. Yeah, so high, medium, and low, high, medium, and low, and then you plot where the risk falls on there. So these are your impact and probabilities, and this is a qualitative assessment. Now, this is a 3x3, but you might want to, in your business, have a 4x4 or 5x5 or 5x4 or whatever. So you do have the ability in the tool to create what we call your own impact types and create your own heat map. So you can define how many categories you've got in each, and therefore how many cells you've got on your heat map. And you can even decide on the color codes as well of the different squares within the components within the heat map. You can actually grade it how you wish. And then the other type of assessment is what we call a quantitative assessment. And that is basically calculating the expected loss figure. Okay, so as I said before, if the impact would cost us 500,000 if that risk occurred, and we think it's going to happen 2 times in the year, then obviously we've got a risk assessment. We've got a expected loss of something in the region of £1 million. Okay, and what we do, this is a quantitative heat map. What we do when we set it up is that we can define these boundary positions. So if you looked at any of these points here on this heat map, we said, right, so we've got a reduced frequency of, let's say, 1. It's going to happen 1 time a year. And if you read up to the line where it touches between green and yellow and read across, then that will be about 500,000. So that's 500,000. Likewise, if you were to go over here and say expected frequency 2, and you read up and you read along, it's going to be 250. So 2 times 250 is 500. So any point along that line between green and yellow represents 500,000. That's your lower limit. Then your upper limit, in this case, is set to about 1 million. Yeah, so it gives you these kind of swim lines here within the graph. And again, you just plot where your risk falls. So in this case, we're saying this risk occurs potentially 3 times in a year, and it's going to have something like a million, 1.1 million or something like that as an impact. So the actual expected loss is 3 times 1.1, 3 and 3.3 million. Okay, so you just plot where that falls within here. So the graphs look different. They're effectively doing nothing. You can color code these. You can set these for the lines, set the upper and lower limits accordingly, so that this will look slightly different for each, how you set it. And again, you can have these heat maps for and view the inherent results, and then you can review or look at the residual results. So again, what's the risk like with assuming no controls? What's the risk like now, given the fact we've got these controls? And you should see in each case, hopefully, these risks sort of being pushed to the left-hand side. So going from the red, hopefully, into the orange, the yellow, or the green, and the same here. So high risk, and medium probability might be pushed down into this square here. Okay, so that's basically what we can do, and we've got certain parameters that we can set within administration in the tool. So very briefly, this is a screenshot of the administration area in ASCM. And if we go to what we call the environment, the database that you're populating, there is a risk management tab, and in here, there's a number of parameters. So first of all, for example, we can determine whether or not we wish to set limits for notifications. So if we wanted to notify a risk manager, if the threshold for the risk was above a certain value, we can put that threshold in here. Okay, so we can do it for inherent and we can do it for residual. So by the way, this score, by the way, is like, if you're talking inherent scores, you can assign scores to your categories. So high, medium, low. Low might be 1, medium 2, high 3 for impact and probability. So if you've got a high risk, high probability, high impact, high probability, then it could be a score of 9, 3 times 3. Or it's a 1 and a 1, that'd be a low and a low, yeah? So you can put your scores in here. So maybe said if it's inherent and it's a score of 6 or over, we want to inform a certain role within the business, okay, a certain risk manager level. So we can do it inherent and residual, and the same for quantitative assessments. So for that, you know, if the value goes over, say, 1 million, we want to be informed again and notify a particular risk manager. And again, we can do that for inherent and residual. I don't know if someone's got their mic open or something, but it's got a bit of feedback this end. If you can just, that's great. I think that's it. So again, these are notification threshold notifications, and I think you've got the difference there. And then the other thing that we can do is we can create our own impact type. So out of the box, the system comes with what's called a default impact type, but we can create new impact types if you want. So if you didn't want the standard 3x3, you wanted a 4x4, 5x5 heat map, then you can create your own impact type, and you can rename these categories accordingly. Yeah. So here we got a 4x4, and you can call these whatever you wish, whatever makes sense to you. And you can allocate scores to them, as you can see that we've done here. You don't have to, but you certainly can if you wish to. And as you say, that would determine how many cells you have in your grid. And then you can choose the color scheme as well for each of the cells in your heat map. Incidentally, as well, you might wish to have impact types that represent different views. So, for example, if you wanted to assess the risk from a perspective of impact on the environment, or if you wanted to assess the risk through the impact on staff or on customers, you can have different impact types that you could use and define, and then literally assess the same risk a multiple number of times from a different perspective. And you could use impact types for that as well. And then the last two components you've got in the impact type as well, you can have an attribute called detectability. So if the risk occurs, how quickly would we pick it up? Are we likely to pick it up immediately, or within 24 hours, or would it be some sort of longer time frame? And again, you can add scores to those as well. And the same for trends. So is this risk a rising risk, or i.e. negative, you know, it's increasing in its severity potentially, and its occurrence, then it's going to be a negative, or it could be positive, i.e. it's coming down, or it could just be neutral. So again, you can have these categories, this attribute here, and you can define as many as you need and allocate scores as well. And these scores then can be incorporated with the others. So, for example, if you want to have a risk score, you could say, well, it's the extent times the frequency times the detectability times the trend. It'll give you a risk score. The higher the number, the more worrisome that risk will become. And then you can rank your risks against each other to see which are the worst risks and those risks that need attention. Okay, so that's the administration part. And again, what I will do now is just quickly show you that in the tool. Oh. Trying to find it. I'm trying to find it on here. There we go. All right, so I'm not logged in. So what I'm going to do is just I'm going to jump across to the ARCM. And you can do that from ARIS Connect. So you can see here that I've got this link to it called ARIS Risk and Compliance. And just clicking on that will take me straight into the tool. Now, it takes me to the home module, but I'm going to go to the administration module. And again, this user's got everything, okay? So he's an administrator as well. So I'm going to jump to what we call the environments. Now, each one of these represents a database. So if I open this one, which is the one we're using for this demonstration. So this is the database within the tool, and it's linked to an ARIS database. So the information that we model in this database is what populates this environment within ARIS ARCM. And on the second tab, we have this risk management tab. So here are the notifications that I was talking about. So at the moment they're switched off, but if I wanted to have active notifications, then I can say yes. For qualitative assessments, I want active notification. And so I might say, right, if I'm using a 3x3 and I've got 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 as my scores for each high, medium, and low, I might say, well, if it goes over 6, or if it goes over 4 here, I don't know, I'm just making it up. So this is inherent and this is residual. So after the controls have taken effect, we assume that anything higher than a 4, we want to notify a risk manager. Now there's different levels of risk manager. I won't go into that now, but you can determine which role you need to advise if it exceeds these limits. And in the same way, you could set those limits for the quantitative values as well. So you might say, right, well, if it's a risk that's going to cost me more than £1 million, there's a bit of a delay on my keyboard, for inherent, or if it's going to cost me more than 500,000 for any residual risk assessment, then I want to notify a particular manager. Okay, so environment level manager, the risk manager sees all risk, whatever the type. So if you've got different groups like sales or IT risk, it doesn't matter. This guy is going to see it all, whereas the object specific managers are only going to see those risks to which they're connected to in modeling, i.e. the sales related risks or the IT related risks. So you determine which role you want to notify if any of these limits are broken or exceeded. So that's one thing. And the other thing, just quickly to show you, is the financial impact types. That's the impact type. So there's your default. And as you can see, if I click on default, you've just got high, medium, and low, and a 3x3 grid map, heat map. But if I want to create new ones, I can create a new one, and I have done so. So I've got 2 here. One's a financial impact. And you give a name, you can give it a description as well. And I've said you get to choose whether it's qualitative or quantitative when you set it up. And you can, sorry, it's going slow now. And you can also decide on your limits. So those heat maps that you showed you, not the swim lanes, but the quantitative risk assessment heat maps, you can determine your upper and lower limits. So anything lower than a 500,000 in this case will show as green. Anything over 1 million will show as red, and the middle part is going to be amber. And you can do that again for the for inherent and for residual as well. So you could have different limits for the residual one if you wanted to. And then just quickly showing you the other impact type, which is the inherent one. Again, name and description. This time I said it's qualitative. I can choose whether or not to include the residual values or just stick to an inherent value. It's up to me. So I can choose. In this case, I said yes, I want to see both. And again, I've put down 4x4 in this case. So again, you can name these categories, and I can click on that and go and rename it, and I can add scores again. So this time I'm going to have a 4x4 matrix. There it is. And again, if I click on a color on one of the cells, I can choose what colors I want to have in each individual cell. Okay, so once I've done that, I'm basically enabled different risk assessments of the same risk. So I could risk assess the same risk in multiple ways. And as I said, the impact type might be environmental, or about staff, the impact on staff, or impact on customers, or our reputation. You could have different impact types and name these accordingly if you wanted to. Okay, so that's that. Very quickly, what I want to do is go back to the slide deck, and I'm conscious now I've got 15 minutes. I want to go to talk about the workflow now. So the workflow here is just a representation of it. So the system will determine when to create these risk assessments based on the parameters you put in on your risk. It will generate the issue, generate the task, and it will allocate it to the owner that you find, the owner group that you assign. Okay, and that owner will receive a task in their queue. They action the assessment, and once they set their status, it then pushes it through to a risk assessor, somebody that checks to see, do they agree with this assessment, etc. So they have all the same information that's available to the assessor, and they can push it back. So if they don't agree, they can push it back. It takes the status off that task, and they will have to then do it again. But if they're happy with that assessment, it pushes it through and completes the assessment. And then it's available within the evaluations module of the tool. Okay, so that's basically what it is. And then just finally, before I go and show you a risk assessment in the last 15, 20 minutes, this is where you see the results of the assessment in the evaluation module in ARCM, which is like the inbuilt reporting tool. So you will have options to see the results of risk assessments by different hierarchies, typically process, organizational units, risk categories, and I think application systems as well. So when you click on one of those categories, it will then give you the hierarchy on your left, and then it will show you the results of those assessments across here. So what was the impact, what was the probability, and it will show you the heat maps for inherent and residual, so that you can click on these heat maps and you can see where those risks fall, whichever one you're looking at. So here it's a process hierarchy, but it might be organizational structure or whatever. And again, you have to select what impact type. So if you've got multiple impact types, you have to say, which impact type am I looking at here? And then it will filter accordingly. Okay, so let me jump onto the tool and give you the last 15 minutes on the tool itself. So let me close that. So here we are. Sorry, pressed twice. Okay, so I'm going to just go back to Connect now. I'm just closing this window. So what I'm going to do is, from ARIS Connect, you can reach your GRC task. So if I click on the menu in the corner here, you can see that I've got an option called My GRC Tasks. I can also jump straight to the tool itself, and it will take me to the home module. But in this case, I think it's better to show you this functionality. So if I click on My GRC Tasks, it will then show me all the tasks that I've got allocated within the ARCM workflow tool. And as you can see, they've got different symbols. So these are all different types of tasks, not just risk assessments. But I can filter that list. And I can use the filter here and say, I just want to see risk assessments. Apply filter. And now you can see that it's just listed all the risk assessments that I have available for me. I'm the assigned risk assessor. And if I want to pick one, so let's pick the one we're looking at, the inaccurate invoice processing. And you can see that, it's gotten to the 29th of November to complete it, but I can open it from here. And it jumps me straight into the workflow tool. So in this case, you can see that there's a warning that, actually there's been some losses assigned to this risk. So check them out before you do your assessment. But if there wasn't any losses, then obviously you wouldn't see this warning here. So what have we got? We've got a number of tabs. So this is the risk assessment case itself. The front screen here really, oh dear. I'll go for the information. I can't access it from here because it's not done yet. Yeah. No, it's not going to let me do it. I'm going to pick another one. Let me pick another. That task had already locked itself for some reason. Let me just pick another risk assessment task. So this is my risk assessment. Sorry, this is my workflow list, again, within the tool. It's the same thing you saw from earlier, but this time I'm actually in ARCM home module itself. So I can select risk assessments and apply it. And let's go into just another one that should be open. Yeah, so this one's open. So what have I got on the front task sheet? So I've got, obviously, what risk does this risk assessment relate to? And I can click on that and go and see details of the risk. These are my assessment activities. This is what I must do to assess the risk. Then it's basically some general settings. So am I assessing this risk based on my expertise, or am I doing it for review or documentation, basically? So I'm going to say expertise, and it's this internal or external sources of data that I'm using. Let's say internal. So, but these are configurable. So if you didn't want to use these, or you wanted to change the names of the labels or the contents of the drop downs, we can configure it, of course. And then down here, we've got what's the result of the assessment. So if I complete the assessment, I set it to assessed. If I couldn't do it for whatever reason, then I'm going to set it to not assessed. Or if I close it now, basically leave it in progress, it will go back into my work queue, and it won't go anywhere until I action it, or until it closes itself after the due date's expired. Okay, so that's what I need to do when I've completed. But let's just look at some of the other tabs. So this is where I'm going to do my assessment. But before I do that, I want to show you the other two tabs here. So information is just saying, oh, this risk then is associated with this process. It's part of this risk category. It affects this organizational unit. So all the connections that you made in ARIS are available here. And again, you can click on here to see any more details of the org unit or whatever it is. Also down the bottom here, you see who's been assigned to perform the task. So this Tom Owen is part of this group here. So I'm the assessor, I'm in this group. And there's a different reviewer assigned to do the reviewing of it. This is an important tab, the list tab. So under the list tab, you've got all relevant information that will help you assess it. So have there been any incidents related to this risk? And therefore any losses incurred? What controls has this risk got? So in this case, this risk has 3 different controls. And have those controls been tested? Yes. So there's been a number of tests. And in this case, they've just expired and not been done. But you would see, like, yes, it's failed, or it's been successful. So you'd see a complete history of all the tests performed for these controls. So clearly, that will feed into your residual risk assessment, because you know that, okay, it's got control, but they're not effective, or they're very good. They keep the risk. They help mitigate the risk. So I'm inclined to reduce the impact or reduce the probability. In a similar way, if there's any risks or issues related to the risk as well, we can find out information about that. Has there been any surveys performed on the risk, or any questionnaires sent out? All part of different workflows available within the tool. Okay, so we've got all the information really that we need to make the assessment. And to do the assessment, we can go to the assessment tab. And you can see that here that I've got 3 assessment types available. Now, I don't have to do them all, but for example, if I want to do the default one, I'd click on the default tab, and it would just say, okay, I want to do quantitative or qualitative, and I'd select accordingly and fill it in. But I'm going to use these other two. So I'm going to do one financial and then one qualitative one, just to show you the differences. So here, what we're saying is, if this risk occurs, how much is it going to cost me? Let's say it's going to cost me £1 million if it occurs. And I think it's going to occur 2 times or potentially twice in a year, or the period I'm under review. That's on an inherent basis, ignoring controls. Now, if I say I've got some controls, I tested them and they're effective, I think it's going to reduce that impact to 500,000, say. But I don't think it's going to affect the frequency. Well, it might be the other way around. It might not. It might reduce the frequency, potential frequency, but it might not. It will still be the same impact. So, you know, or it could do both. So again, it's just your opinion as a reviewer, as an assessor, as to how those controls help mitigate. So in this case, 1 million and reduce it to 500,000 with the controls being good. And I can basically save that. I can add comments as well, of course, down the bottom. I can add my own comments here. And you can see what it's done is calculated for me an expected loss figure. So on an inherent basis, I expect to lose 2 million. But with the controls I've got in place, if it happens, it's likely it's going to reduce it to 1 million. So that's one assessment. But I could also do another one. So this time I'm going to use this other impact type I've got available. And it's asking me to say, well, okay, this is the qualitative one. So I'm going to say, actually, I think it's a high probability, high impact. I think it's probably an average frequency. I think we should pick it up within a week if it happened. And let's say it's a neutral trend. So that's my inherent, and the same for residual. I think that I'm going to reduce the impact to average. It's not going to change potentially the, come on. Come on, it's gone a bit slow at the moment. So it's not going to change the frequency. I think we'd probably pick it up quicker if we, you know, with these controls, but it's still a neutral trend. So when I save that one, again, I can add my comments. You can see that it's given me a risk score because each one of these has a score associated with it. So it's just one times the other to give me a score. So you can see now that it's halved this risk score. And this helps me, you know, show it against other risks as well, and be able to compare which are my worst risks. Again, add any remarks, and I can save it. Okay, so that's my risk assessments done. All I need to do now is set my status. So I was successfully able to assess it, and I'm just going to save it. These are not mandatory, by the way. So I'm just going to save it now. And once I save it, I've completed my risk assessment. Oops. What have I done wrong? Oh, okay, I didn't do it. Okay. Not specified. Save it. So once I save it, it completes that assessment for me. And you can see that it stamps the status and the date and time that it was done and who did it. Now, if I was to go to my task list, this particular one, incorrect journal entries, is now left my queue and it's gone to the risk assessors queue. So if I now quickly just log out here and log in as the risk assessor, sorry, the risk reviewer, beg pardon, risk reviewer, which is another user. And in his work queue, I would just filter it for the risk assessments. I should have, which one was it? Incorrect journal entries, this one, I think. Yeah, so this is when it was done. And that user has the same information available about what controls, etc. And they can see the results of the assessment. And also, I didn't mention, but you can also attach documents as well if you wanted to, in order to give more further evidence about why you assess it the way you did. So given that, you can then set, if you reject it, it pushes it back to the assessor, and if you accept it, then you accept it and you save it. And then that is the end of the risk assessment. Okay, so again, it stamps the status for the reviewer, and it will also say who it's reviewed by, so who did it. Now, if I then go to, lastly, in the last 2 or 3 minutes, just go to the evaluations module here. This is where I can see the results of the assessment. So as you can see, I've got lots of different options because this guy's got lots of different roles. But for risk management, we're going to the risk assessments, and I'm going to look at, say, I don't know, quantitative view. And then you see that you've got an option of different hierarchies. So obviously application system, organizational structure, process, and so on. And what I can do again is choose my impact type and then apply the filter. And then over here, you can see I've got a structure that I can start to expand this out one by one. But if I want to expand it all, I can just click on this button here. And what it's done is it's picked the process structure up, and it's just brought out that hierarchy down the left-hand side. And all the results are aggregated up. So in entirety, I've got 8 risks. I've done 5 have been assessed, and I've got the information that I need. Okay, so if I click on, I'm not sure how good this is going to be now in terms of the bands that are set up. Come on, there you go. So you can see that there's green on the side here, and there's the amber, and there's the red, and you can see where it's plotted the risk. So if I hover over any of these, it tells me what risk it is. And if I click on it, it takes me to the risk, and I can look at that risk assessment. Okay, so I can link to it from here. That's the inherent view. But if I want to look at the residual one, I could click on there. You see a better flow here. You can see how they're plotted. So again, these risks should have moved down a little bit from where they were before. And as I say, you've got different options under the evaluation. So you can see it, and that was by process, but I might want to see it by organizational structure or by regulations or risk category. There's quite a number. And there's also the ability as well to extract information from ARCM and use it as a data feed for a dashboard. But I am very conscious of time. I think we've basically come to the end of the flow. And as I say, the only other thing is going back into ARIS, into the ARIS Connect. You can actually look at the results of the risk assessments as well. So if I show you the model I was looking at before, just in the last minute, if I take you to that particular risk and look at the fact sheet, it is going slow. I do apologize. Now it seems to have died. Okay, so the results of the risk assessments and any incidents as well are accessible within ARIS Connect as well. So that's it, really. I think it's all I've got time for. So I hope you've found that whistle-stop tour quite useful. I hope it could give you food for thought. And if you do have any questions, then please get in touch. Given the time now, I think we've run out of time. But thank you very much for your attention.